What's going on, guys? Nathan here, back again with another fantastic deck tech for you all. Today we are taking a look at the face down archetype and how we can build it as high power as we can. Now, Duskmourn graced us with the most powerful face down commander, in my personal opinion, that Wizards has printed so far, Zimone Mystery Unraveler. Now, as a quick aside, I did look at building Kadena Slicking Sorcerer, which is the other dominant face down matters commander out there, but I found that while Kadena could be a very powerful draw engine herself, she incentivizes playing a lot of morph creatures, and you have to actually pay the costs, mostly within the Face Down Matters archetypes, to flip up morph creatures, and there are just not enough support cards that allow you to simply turn your creatures face up, and so for that reason, I wanted to stay away from Kadena and move towards Zimone instead. Now, Zimone was the precon commander for the Duskmourn set, and this deck has no relation to the precon. This was built independently as high power as I could, and so this, I think, is the most optimized way to build Zimone in 2024 Commander. Before we get into the video, just like to ask, if you like this content, leave a like on the video and subscribe if you want to stay tuned for more content like this. I would appreciate it. And then I will also be recording a gameplay video where I will be playtesting this 2 or 3 times just to show you guys how it works. So I will have that link down in the description, and you can click that to see how this deck actually works and plays and functions. And then finally, at the end of the video, I'll just go over really quick the reasons why I haven't been uploading, but I'm sure most of you don't care about that. So we'll go get right into the deck tech here. So when we take a look at the deck stats, I actually, before we read Zimone, actually just want to go through the price of the deck, since I think that is actually something a lot of people care about. This deck comes in at about $670. However, if you look at the top 10 most expensive cards, they constitute about $350. So you can get this deck down to about $320 if you take out the top 10 cards, which are entirely replaceable. Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, you can sub in any budget fetch land, any of the panoramas, I think, are fair game. Bristly Bill Spinesower, you can substitute with any Overrun, the Ana creature, Prismatic Vista, Scalding Tar, Misty Rainforest. These are all fetch lands that you can actually substitute just slower fetch lands with. In particular, I'm already using a lot of the, we'll call it immediate fetch lands, such as Cabaret Courtyard, which is sacrificed when it enters. And so you would have to reach towards the bottom of the barrel for fetch lands for this particular deck as it's set up right now. And so you'd be going into more of the panoramas. So Bant Panorama is in the deck, but you could work with like Jund Panorama, Grixis Panorama, etc. Abhorrent Oculus you can replace, although this is arguably the best card in the deck. And there's a few other cards here that you can replace. Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Consecrated Sphinx both are very powerful cards, but are replaceable. So when we take a look at Zimone and what we're trying to be doing, our general game plan is to be playing lands. So Zimone itself says, first of all, it's a 3/3 human wizard. It has landfall whenever land you control enters Manifest Dread if this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. Otherwise, you may turn a permanent you control face up. And to Manifest Dread, we look at the top 2 cards of our library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. Turn it face up at any time for its mana cost if it's a creature card. Notably, let's take a look at how many creatures we're running. Holy crap, it's 55 creatures. So this is very intentionally heavy on creatures so that we are most likely going to hit those Manifest Dread triggers off of Zimone to always be manifesting creatures and never hit a dead Manifest Dread. And then let's just cover some stats really quick. If we take a look at our mana curve, oh my gosh, that is absolutely massive. And in fact, if we jump over to Moxfield once again, we see that our average mana curve after adjusting for custom mana costs is about 4.13 without lands. Boy, is that a hefty mana curve, but the reason why is because Zimone will help us cheat all of our creatures into play, and so I don't think that's a realistic depiction of the cost we will actually be playing for our creatures, given that our primary game plan is to get Zimone on the battlefield, play a fetch land, and then once we start manifesting Dread out of our creatures, protect her from there. This is a very mana cheat focused commander, binder, and so that's what we plan to do by playing as many fetch lands as we can. And if we go down here, let's take a look at our land analysis. So we're running 27 green sources, 23 blue sources, 10 tapped lands, which I think is acceptable. Normally I like to see between 8 and 10, but we can work with the higher end of the range if we have a lot of synergy with tapped fetch lands. We are running 20 total fetch lands. Okay, that's very important. This mana base has been optimized to get as many fetches out on the battlefield as we can. Notably though, we are going to be searching up a lot of basics, and so this is not really a Field of the Dead type of deck, and so we're running quite a few basics though to fetch all of these out. And I will say one of my pet peeves with landfall decks is that when you are always fetching once, twice, 3 times a turn, your turns tend to take a while, but I do think this is an okay exception because you can grab basics, and basics are very easy to physically find within your deck when you actually flip it up and start to search. And so I'm okay with it as long as the fetching action itself is very quick, instead of always having to look for your triomes, for example, or you're looking to pull a specific shock out of your deck. It just makes fetching very long. But if we're just grabbing basics, not too bad. There's 7 other utility lands and then 9 lands that actually force us to lose life, such as our fetch lands, taking 1, etc. Okay, and we'll talk about the mana base in a little bit, but first I want to jump into our ramp category. So once again, our game plan in general is hopefully we ramp on turn 2 if we draw one of our turn 2 ramp spells. Also, these are all going to be creatures, so we're a little bit limited on what kind of ramp spells we have at the lower end of the curve if they have to come on creature bodies. Then once we have 4 lands in play, we don't want to play Zimone with 4 lands. We always want to play Zimone and then be able to immediately play a 5th land and then crack it. Okay, so we're not going to be playing Zimone until turn 4 approximately. So when we look at our ramp spells in the early game, what are we looking to have in hand? Let me jump to a few of our lower curve options here, but we'll actually go through each card. Dawn Treader Elk is going to allow us to play that creature body, but then for only 1, we can ramp out a basic. So this can help us to accelerate ourselves in the early game if we just want to crack it for the actual ramp. But also it is nice because you can store that landfall trigger on a body, and then for 1 mana, essentially, if you can get a landfall trigger off of Zimone, which will help you turn a creature face up and basically cheat all of its mana. Also, we have some earlier options such as Elvish Reclaimer. Now, Elvish Reclaimer is unique because it can grab any land out of your deck. Normally, this is used to grab crazy powerful lands like Glacial Chasm or Field of the Dead, but in our case, we actually care about 2 things. First, we can just sack a land to get a land card on the battlefield tapped, which will activate our landfall trigger. Great. But we also can use, because the land will have to enter tapped, we can actually search up, in particular, Simic Growth Chamber, for example, which will essentially allow us to draw a card by returning a tapped land we controlled to its owner's hand. There is also, we can search up, for example, our Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, which is important because if we are playing a lot of fetch lands, we actually want to be able to tap them for mana and save up those fetch triggers for a giant explosive turn to essentially pull a bunch of value out of our behind in order to get a very swingy type of turn in the late game. We are also running Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. That's right, you can run an Urborg in a Simic deck, once again, because although it is a colorless land for all intents and purposes for our deck, it allows us to tap our fetch lands for mana, which is absolutely important. Okay. So those are some of the better options in the early game, but let me go over all of our options here within the ramp category. So Ancient Green Warden will allow us to play lands from our graveyard, and it will double up our landfall triggers, both things we want to be doing in this deck. Also, you will notice that a lot of these options are expensive cards, but ideally, I was looking to build the deck around creatures that also have cheap abilities to allow them to get into play early. So for example, Azusa, for example, is great in both the early game and the late game by allowing us to play 2 additional lands on each of our turns. Fanatic of Ronus is great in the early game and late game by being able to tap for 4 in the late game. And then if we took just a little sidetrack here into our drawing card advantage category, a card like Null Drifter, I think, is a great card to include in this deck, because if we draw it into our hand, we can just cast it for 3, or evoke it for 3, draw 2 cards. But if we do get it off of a Manifest Dread trigger, so it's a Null Drifter in a forest, we obviously want the Null Drifter in play, and if we flip it face up, we still get a 4/4 flyer body with Annihilator 1. So you'll notice a pattern here where a lot of these creatures seem expensive, but they may have they're good in both the early and late game, and they also might have an alternative way to get them out early. So Ancient Green Warden, anyway, let's just go back to this really quick. There's also an abundance of cards that allow us to play lands from either our graveyard or the top of our library. So Ancient Green Warden, of course, because we're running so many fetch lands, is almost always going to be able to allow us to never miss a land drop, so that because we can always be playing our fetch lands from our graveyard. Then we have Azusa Last But Seeking, which I went over briefly. 3 mana, we get 2 additional land drops, which can possibly translate to 4 landfall triggers on our turn if we are playing 2 fetch lands back to back. So absolutely amazing with Zimone. Dawn Treader Elk, once again, we can pay the 1 and sack it to ramp out a basic, and that will enter tapped. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is exactly what we want in this deck, because not only does it allow us to play an extra land, but it gives our lands every basic land type in addition to their other types, meaning once again we can tap our fetch lands for mana, which is absolutely awesome to save up those fetch triggers. Elvish Reclaimer we already touched on. Embodiment of Spring, once again, not optimal in a normal deck. Most people would rather play a Nature's Visit, Nature's Lore or 3 visits, but once again we're looking for creatures that can ramp us in the early game, or it can allow us to ramp in the late game for an extra landfall trigger. So Embodiment of Spring is for only 1 mana, we get a 0/3 body, and we can pay 2 to ramp out a basic tapped. Fanatic of Ronus is just a busted card from Modern Horizons 3. I cannot actually believe that this was printed. It's a 2 mana 1/4, 1/4 by the way. What a blocker in the early games, turn 1 and 2. It can tap to add a green, and then if you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you can tap it to add 4 green mana. And on top of that, not only did they think that was fine, it has Eternalize for 4, meaning we can pay 4 mana to exile this thing from the graveyard to create a 4/4 token copy of it that taps for 4 because it enables its own ability. Also, great synergy with Manifest Dread, because of course when you Manifest Dread, 1 creature goes on the battlefield, 1 card goes in the graveyard, and so you can throw Fanatic and the Ronus in the graveyard, pay 4 to get a 4 mana rock. Oh my god, is this card so good. Insidious Fungus, 1 mana 1/2, we can pay 2 and sack it to either destroy target artifact or enchantment, or draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand on the battlefield tapped. So another modal type of card here, to a little fitting a little bit of removal flexibility within our ramp slot. Kami of Whispered Hopes is a bit of an outlier in that it does not force extra landfall triggers, which is what I really tried to focus this ramp category on. However, it does synergize with the +1/+1 counter sub-theme that we have going on in the deck, which you'll see in a little bit. If we get this out and we start putting counters on things, it grows very fast. And then it can tap to add X mana of any one color, where X is its power. Of course, you want to power it up with counters and so forth. Oracle of Moldiah, 4 mana, 2/2, allows us to play an additional land, and we can play lands from the top of our library, which is great. Overlord of the Hauntwoods, so we're probably going to be impending this for 3 if it's in our hand, which allows us to create basically a tapped command tower. And then if we flip it face up, then we get a 6/5 body that does the exact same thing when we attack. So when it attacks, we also get that landfall trigger. So Overlord of the Hauntwoods, exactly what we want to be looking for in a Zimone deck, because you can cheat it out for, if with Zimone's ability to be this late game beater that also generates to us a lot of value. And then we can also actually, if we want to cast it for its lower mana cost mode, then we can certainly do that as well. Ramanak Excavator, 3 mana, you can play lands from a graveyard, exactly what we want to be doing. And then finally we have Steve, which we can save up for a landfall trigger by sacking it to search our library for a basic land card, put the battlefield on the tapped, then shuffle. By the way, I totally forgot, and I should have mentioned, this deck aims to assemble a lethal board state by about turn 7. I've been able to, most of my playtesting, the deck pops around turn 6, and then by between turn 7 and turn 8, depending on if we draw some of our Overrun Finishers, can close out the game by either turn 7 or turn 8. Okay, we're in Simic, we like value, we like drawing cards, we like playing lands, so let's move right into our card draw category here. Of course, we're running AC Tyrant of Gyre straight, 6 mana 5/5, you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and then we can abuse the heck out of this landfall trigger. Whenever a land you control enters, you may draw a card, and we are also running its sister card, Tatyova Benthic Druid. Once again, landfall, whenever a land you control enters, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This basically means that we can be drawing at least 2 cards a turn because we are going to be able to play a fetch, crack it, and then we get the second landfall trigger there. Consecrated Sphinx, everybody knows and loves. This card will sometimes get you killed, but my gosh, does it do a good job of drawing cards. We are hoping to get this off of a Manifest Dread in order to flip it up. Den Protector, when it's turn face up, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Guess what? We're going to be throwing cards in our graveyard, so we got lots of selection there, and so we can get basically a quote-unquote free Eternal Witness effect if we turn Den Protector face up. So let's say we're doing our thing with Zimone. We've got these big beaters that we want to flip up first, and Den Protector is in our hand. Well, we can also just cast it and morph it for 3 and then turn it face up for 2 mana. I mean, we're playing a lot of landfall, and so we're going to be ramping a lot, and so that is to say that this card is completely playable if we wanted to play it for its morph cost as well. Fairy Mastermind, again, a low cost creature that can possibly draw us cards. This is exactly what we want to have in our card draw category, because whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. Great to flip off of Zimone, or great to just flash in from your hand. Guardian Project is a bit of a unique rules interaction with Manifest. In particular, Manifest cards do not have names, and so any card that is manifested while Guardian Project is on the field will draw a card off of Guardian Project because it does not have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard. So pretty neat interaction there. Basically, this says whenever you manifest Dread, just draw a card for each creature that enters, essentially. Null Drifter, we already touched on a little bit, but we can pay 3 to draw 2, or if we flip this up, we have a 4/4 flyer body with Annihilator 1. So once again, just sort of meshing as much removal into our other categories as we can, building all of that soft synergy. Then we have Oblivious Bookworm, 2 mana 2/3 human wizard. At the beginning of your end step, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card unless permanent enters the battlefield face down on your control this turn, or you turn a permanent face up this turn. So just a nice 2 mana body that is essentially a Phyrexian Arena, of course without the life loss, but this condition will be very trivial to meet within this particular deck. Then we have Polywog Prodigy, 2 mana 1/3 Frog Wizard with Evolve, which means whenever creature you control enters, if that creature has greater power toughness than this creature, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Again, building on that soft synergy and sub-theme of +1/+1 counters. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Polywog Prodigy's power, draw a card. So notably, this is cool because if we get this out early on turn 2 or turn 3, and then we play Zimone. Zimone is a 3-power creature, so we'll get the +1/+1 counter onto the Polywog Prodigy, and I really think that you do need to power this card up by perhaps 1 or 2 +1/+1 counters before it starts to actually get good. But also, if we just happen to buff this with any of our other buff spells, +1/+1 counter spells, etc., then this gets even better. Soul of the Harvest, 6 mana 6/6 trample. Whenever another non-token creature ETB is under your control, you may draw a card. So if we were to cast, for example, let's move to our face down makers here. So like Abhorrent Oculus, for example, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Manifest Dread. Those are non-token creatures that enter the battlefield, and so we do get draw triggers off of Soul of the Harvest. Now, it's a little bit expensive for what you get at 6 mana, in my personal opinion, but it doesn't have the cast stipulation like something like a Primordial Sage, and so I think this is something you probably want to flip up with Zimone alone, but it can be a great source of card draw with your face down makers. Tattoo we already went over. The Reality Trip, 2 mana 0/4 legendary artifact creature equipment jellyfish. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as the Reality Trip is attached to a creature, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, and it can attach for 3 mana. So this is going to be able to help us generate a bunch of card advantage by casting spells and so forth. And also it helps us to know what we're going to be able to manifest dread at least one half of the cards that we look at. And then also, so we can make those land drops, etc., but it's also a creature, which is awesome. So technically, if this thing gets manifested, we can turn it up for only 2 mana, which I think is very much worth it. And then we have Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. God, I hate this border treatment. Oh my god, it's so ugly. But anyway, we want to flip this face up because we get to skip its ETB trigger, which it says when it ETBs, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And importantly, we want the attack trigger. When it ETBs or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Okay. So what are some other ways to make face down creatures? Well, we already touched on briefly Abhorrent Oculus, 3 mana 5/5. As an additional cost to cast a spell, exile 6 cards from your graveyard, which, to be honest, I don't think is that hard to meet that condition. But ideally, we'd like to get this off of a Manifest Dread trigger, and then turn it face up to skip that hoop to jump through. It has flying. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Manifest Dread. So we're just going to be spamming tons of manifest creatures, and we can then flip them up with a bunch of landfall triggers with Zimone. So great synergy there. Curator Beastie, 6 mana 6/6 with reach. Colors creatures you control enter with 2 additional 1/1 counters on them. Great +1/+1 counter synergy and fits into our subtheme. When he enters or attacks, Manifest Dread. So if we cast it for the 6, we get the Manifest Dread trigger. Typically, I think for 6 mana, we'd probably want to be flipping this face up. I think it's a little bit overcosted at 6 mana, but we do get that attack trigger as well as the buffing static effect. Experiment 12, 4 mana 4/4 trample. Whenever it or another creature control is turned face up, put X +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to its power, and it has a disguise ability. If it's in our hand, we can cast it for 3, and then with the Zimone Landfall trigger, we can turn it face up. And then also building on our +1/+1 counter subtheme. Growing Dread, 2 mana enchantment with flash. When it enters, Manifest Dread, and then whenever you turn a permanent face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Great synergy, and I think it's probably worth it to Manifest Dread for either 1, maybe 2 mana. The fact that this does have flash does save it a little bit. I think it does exactly what we want to be doing, which is Manifest Dread and then putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Then we have They Came from the Pipes, 5 mana enchantment. When it enters, Manifest Dread twice, and then whenever face down creature you control enters, draw a card. So just also stapling a bunch of card draw onto our Manifest Dreading. Under the Skin, great uncommon from Duskmourn. I actually drafted this in Limited, and it is fantastic. 3 mana sorcery, Manifest Dread. You may return a permanent card from a graveyard to your hand. Notably, we can grab a land if we're out of lands, or we can just grab any of the cards we've been throwing into our graveyard from the Manifest Dread triggers. Then we have the primary finisher in the deck. Hopefully we cast this for 9 mana or so. Valgavas Onslaught, XX and a green, Manifest Dread X times, then put X +1/+1 counters on each of those creatures. Now if we have, for example, Kami Whispered Hopes on the battlefield, we get additional +1/+1 counters. So if you do the math for this card, the rate is disappointing with the lower X values, but let's say if we were to cast this for 7, for example, so X would be 3, we get 3 Manifest Dreads, and then we put 3 +1/+1 counters on those, so we get 3 5/5s for 7 mana. That's okay in Commander, but if we get up to 9, now we have 4 Manifest Dreads, and we have 4 1 counters on those creatures, so we get 4 6/6s, which is probably where we want to be. And if we move up even further, then for, oh my goodness, I got to do math. So for 11 mana, we would get 5 7/7s, which now we're talking about a game-ending spell. Vannifar Evolved Enigma, 4 mana 3/4. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose 1. We get to cloak a card from our hand, and then we could put a 1/1 counter on each colorless creature we control. Once again, building on that soft synergy with +1/+1 counters. Now let's take a look at our finishers, and then we'll touch on our defense after that. So rounding out our offensive strategy here, we have our Overrun Finishers. So Bristly Spill Spine Sower is just such a good card. One of the best cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, in my personal opinion. 2-mana 2/2 landfall. Whenever your land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and we can pay 5, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. My God, is that amazing. Also, this fits the creature template for what we would be looking for, where if we draw this within our hand, we're happy to play it for 2 and then pay the 5 at a later point in time in the game. But if we do happen to turn this face up, we still can pay the 5 then to get that overrun type of effect, to get the power boost on board immediately. So it's very nice there. Defiler of Vigor is going to make our green permanent spells 1 green less to cast by paying 2 life instead. And then importantly, whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Very, very good. Then we have Dreamtide Whale, just another completely busted card from MH3. My gosh, is this ridiculous. 3 mana 7/5. 3 mana 7/5. Okay, I guess we're doing that now. Vanishing 2. This creature enters the battlefield with 2 time counters on it at the beginning of your upkeep. Remove a time counter from it when the last is removed. Sacrifice it. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, proliferate. And that does not say opponents. So the odds of you not being able to multi-spell within a given turn is so low in a landfall deck. It is crazy. And let alone if your opponents are going to be multi-spelling, this thing is going to be sticking around forever and you're going to be able to proliferate all of your counters. It's great. It's amazing. Then we have Emissary Green, 5 mana 3/3 Human Advisor. When it attacks, starting with you, each player votes for profit or security. You create a number of treasure tokens equal to twice the number of profit votes. Put a number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control equal to the number of security votes. Okay, so the way to work this card is that you always want to, unless you are desperate for mana for some reason, you're always going to vote for the +1/+1 counters, making Emissary Green a 4/4. Now, when it attacks, is a 4/4 likely to survive combat in 2024 Commander? Probably not, so just assume that you'll get 1 trigger off of this before it probably dies. However, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures, very good with all of our multiplier effects, such as Kami Whispered Hopes, for example. And then your opponents, if they know what's good for them, are probably going to give you the treasure tokens. So in 1 attack trigger, you will probably make 6 treasures and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And if you flip this up, that's for 0 mana off of a Zimone flip. So just absolutely insane value with Emissary Green here. And if your opponents don't know better and they give you the counters, well, now they have given you literally the tools to beat them with. So Emissary Green, great add for the deck with +1/+1 counter synergy. Forgotten Ancient is going to put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on creatures. Whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from it onto other creatures. That's absolutely great. And also, I just noticed at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So you can actually split up the creatures. Like if we have a Kami Whispered Hopes on the battlefield, for example, and we have 2, I don't know, manifest creatures, right? So we can put 1 +1/+1 counter on each, and those will each be multiplied. So if we have, 7 creatures on board, and we put 1 of them on each of them, then we've given each of them 2 +1/+1 counters to get more value off of Forgotten Ancient. So very good synergy there. Loyal Guardian, little overcosted for the effect, but it is a more +1/+1 counter synergy that allows us to get a creature buff the turn that is either faced up or is played. Because it is a 4/4 trample at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Pretty good there. We just gotta have to make sure that Zimone does not die. Master Biomancer, 2/4 each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on an equal to Master Biomancer's power and as a mutant in addition to its other types. So this is absolutely great. If you start stacking counters onto Master Biomancer and you're just manifesting dread off of Zimone, then you are going to generate a crazy board state very quickly with Master Biomancer. Pathbreaker Ibex is a 3/3. Whenever it attacks, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So an overwhelming stampede effect. And notably, again, we're running a lot of attack triggers because theoretically with Zimone, if we then put this as a manifest dread onto the battlefield, then we pass, and then now we get to flip it up with our landfall triggers. The creature can attack right away because we've already flipped, it's already entered before, and so this is much less of a target when it's face down, which allows you to actually flip it up on your next turn and then swing out for the overwhelming stampede effect. Then we have Zapandrel, Hunger Dominus, 7 mana 4/6 with reach at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. Doesn't give trample, but the buff is so good that we don't really care, just because we're going to be triggering this on our own combat if we happen to flip it up on our turn, again giving that buff immediately. Okay, and then we'll cover two more categories here in the offensive category. So Root Elemental is just a nice value piece here. Whenever Root Elemental is turned face up, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. So you ideally want to Manifest Dread this with Zimone, and then when it is turned face up, you are going to be able to put that creature into play. And what I've noticed with this deck is that these big expensive creatures, like we just covered Zapandrel, 7 mana creature, hard to cast from your hand, really hard to cast from your hand, but with Root Elemental, it gets around that, and so I've noticed that if I have the option between Root Elemental and basically any other card in the deck, you know, aside from some exceptions such as Abhorrent Oculus, for example, or Pathbreaker Ibex, you probably just want to pick Root Elemental for your Manifest Dread, because then when you're trying to face up, you just get whatever from your hand into play, which is pretty crazy. Then finally, we are running, or not finally, sorry, second to finally, we have Ashaya Soul of the Wild, 5 mana star. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. Non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. Now this basically means anytime we Manifest Dread or play a creature from our hand, we get the landfall trigger from Zimone. Ashaya goes nuts in Zimone, because if you get a landfall trigger and then you, let's say it's a fetch land, okay, so now you have Manifest Dreaded, you have the creature enter, Zimone sees that as a force entering, you get to flip that creature face up, then you can crack your fetch to then go get another land. You turn another thing face up, and then let's say you play, I don't know, your 2 mana Polyarb Prodigy. Boy, do you just keep getting to flip things face up here, and I can't find Polyarb Prodigy. There it is, for whatever reason. So Ashaya Soul of the Wild goes absolutely crazy, and not only that, not only does it synergize with our commander so perfectly, it makes all of our creatures into mana dorks. So if we need to generate a bunch of mana for that Valgavas Onslaught, or maybe we need to drop both a Zapandrel and a Pathbreaker Ibex from our hand, we can do so. Then we are also running Scute Swarm, just a classic landfall finisher. Basically says that once this thing starts multiplying, you need a board wipe or you're going to lose, because it is very hard to lose with a Scute Swarm, aside from, you know, stacked pieces being on the board, etc., etc. Once we have basically 3 or 4 of them on board, I think it's really hard to get rid of them after that. Okay, let's move into our defensive categories here. So we'll start with our protection spells. Archetype of Endurance, we never want to cast from our hand, and so this is going to want to be a Manifest Dread flip up trigger. It gives creatures we control have hexproof, and then the other part isn't as important in 2024 Commander because I feel like most creatures have ward rather than hexproof, but it can be nice, I guess, if you run across some hexproof in your games. Creatures you control have hexproof is going to protect Zimone from targeted removal, and one comment I'll quick make in our protection category. Normally in a Simic deck, you would run board protection spells like Heroic Intervention, like Obscuring Haze, things like that. Because we were so heavily focused on creatures, I didn't think that those particular spells added a lot to the deck synergy-wise. So what I have admitted to myself as a weakness in this deck, because we are going to be playing so many lands and drawing so many cards, I'm just going to admit that this deck is probably weak to board wipes, but because we generate so much mana card advantage, we can replay Zimone, and then Zimone itself is a card advantage engine, and so I think that ultimately we can protect ourselves from targeted removal. We're probably not going to protect ourselves against board wipes, so you know your mileage may vary when it comes to anticipating board wipes that your opponents will cast. Become Anonymous, one of the very few non-creature spells in this deck, 4 mana instant from the Assassin's Creed set. Exile target non-token creature you own and the top 2 cards of your library in a face-down pile, shuffle that pile, then cloak those cards, they enter the battlefield tapped. Now, importantly, we can use this to save Zimone from a targeted removal spell, and then we could just pay 4 to turn her face up. We are absolutely happy to pay 4 to turn a Zimone face up instead of having to pay that commander tax. Guardian Augmenter, 3 mana, 2/2 with flash. Commander creatures you control get +2/+2, and commanders you control have hexproof. This is going to be a great card to play the turn before Zimone so that she is protected as soon as she hits the board. Scion of Draco says each creature you control has vigilance if it's white, hexproof if it's blue, lifelink if it's black, first strike if it's red, and trample if it's green. So this is going to be pulling double duty by giving our creatures evasion, but most importantly, we care about the hexproof on Zimone because Zimone is, of course, blue and green. Sylvan Safekeeper, sack all target creature you control against Shroud until end of turn. Probably going to target Zimone in response to a targeted removal spell. And then Whisperwood Elemental, 5 mana 4/4 at the beginning of your end step, manifest the top card of your library, so we just generate more power on board each turn. And then we can sack it until end of turn, face up non-token creatures you control gain. When this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. So this is our one sort of piece of board wipe protection, because now we can replace all of our face-up creatures with manifested cards, and then if we recast Zimone, we can start turning those face-up. So I'd say out of the deck, I'd probably, if you're looking to make any changes to the deck, the first 2 cards I would replace would be Become Anonymous, and then probably Whisperwood Elemental as well. Those would be the first 2 cards that are maybe cut for whatever you want to add, be it more removal, etc. So speaking of removal, we are running one of my pet cards, and this card can be replaced with a different card of a similar caliber. Blade-Griff Prototype. When it deals combat damage to a player, destroy target non-land permanent of that player's choice that one of your opponents controls. Now, again, this deck is not running any ETBs, right? Because we are not going to be able to get any of the ETBs off of our manifests entering, and so we care about attack and combat damage triggers. This card fits the bill and allows you to play the political game to destroy whatever your opponent has that is potentially threatening the end of the game. Notably, this is much worse if you are the arch enemy, so your mileage may vary there, but it is a nice piece of removal that you can negotiate with your opponents to say, hey, can I hit you for 3 and you destroy that Bolas Citadel so that we don't die next turn? So, and I think most people would say yes. Cityscape Leveler, 8 mana, 8/8 with trample. When you cast a spell and whenever it attacks, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a tap Power Stone token. This is going to be a card we want to flip up with Zimone. It's a little bit expensive for its cast trigger, but can save your butt in the late game if that's all you have left to do. Galecaster Colossus, classic in wizard decks. Tap an untapped wizard you control, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. Look at this, our commander is a wizard, and so we should, in theory, be able to get at least 2 bounce triggers off of Galecaster Colossus, and notably, we are never going to be able to send Zimone into combat in order to hope that she survives, unless she has, like, 10 1/1 counter stacked on her, right? So if we're not going to be using our commander for anything other than sitting around on the battlefield, probably not even going to use it to block just in case we encounter combat tricks, we can tap it to return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, which is pretty great as well. Speaking of wizards, we have Glenalendra Archmage, Fairy Wizard with flying, tap, sack it, counter target non-creature spell, and it has persist. So this is going to be a nice piece of counterspell tech that we can have as a creature sit on the field and be flipped up with Zimone. Really quick, just because I'm curious, let me go back to our Mox field here. How many wizards do we have in the deck? We have 10 wizards in the deck, so not a ton, but not, I mean, there's a decent amount there. And if Zimone, of course, is on the battlefield, that's good enough value, I think, to run Galecaster, even if we only have, I guess, 8 other wizards in the deck besides Galecaster and Zimone. Then we're running Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. Now, again, this is going to be fit into that category of cards that we can flip up and get value from, or if we want to just cast it for its cheap side out of our hand, if we happen to draw it instead of manifesting it, manifest dreading it, then we can do that as well. So 2 mana sorcery, Tail the Suspect. For 2 mana, we can investigate. You may play an additional land this turn. Boy, does that fit into our playstyle here. Or Flying Vigilance 3/4, when it attacks, destroy up to one target artifact. If you control that permanent, draw a card, which you're almost never going to do. And artifacts, of course, need to be destroyed in Commander. Royal Elemental, Landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under control, you may gain control of target creature for as long as you control. Royal Elemental. If this thing is not dealt with, this will win you the game. Just straight up, we are running so many fetch effects, so many extra landfall effects. This can take control of 3 or 4 creatures a turn, and until it is swords, it is a force to be reckoned with and very scary on the battlefield. Silverback Elder. Okay, I had to make a mid-video deck swap here, actually. So I had a Silverback Elder in the deck, but I noticed that it says whenever you cast a creature spell, you get the options to destroy an artifact or enchantment, or look at the top cards of the library, put a land or a creature from among them on the battlefield. We don't want cast triggers for creatures in the deck because we want just regular creatures that do not care about cast triggers or ETB triggers. So instead, I put in Chrome Shell Crab. When it is turned face up, you may exchange control of target creature you control and target creature an opponent controls. Now, of course, it itself is a 3/3, so you can give your opponent this dumb little 3/3, and then you can get their best creature, which is pretty excellent. Then we have Thalicos Deceiver. It has Shadow, and you can sack it to gain control of target creature permanently if it is attacking and unblocked. Now again, this fits our game plan. It's a removal spell on a stick that can just sit on the battlefield as a creature. Once it's flipped up and now ready to attack, with Summoning Sickness now having worn off, you can get the theft effect basically the turn that you attack with it, which is pretty great. And then finally, our last card here, which is perhaps a little bit debatable, Tree Shaker Chimera, 7 mana, 8/5. All creatures able to block Tree Shaker Chimera do so. When it dies, draw 3 cards. Now, this is potentially a very powerful card because not only does it allow your creatures to get through when it is attacking in combat, it will also draw you cards and destroy up to probably 2 or 3 of your opponent's creatures that block. The problem with this is that it's quite overcosted if you're not flipping this up for free with Zimone. I think 7 mana is a lot to pay for this effect. So if you wanted to swap in a different option, I would actually consider Brine Elemental. So Brine Elemental, when it's turned face up, each opponent it skips their next untap step. The reason why this isn't in the deck, although it is very, very good, is just because I think it leads to some feel bads. Basically, you're telling your opponents, yep, just skip your next turn. And so it can be just very annoying creature to have in your deck. Just for, gameplay quality purposes, I do not have it in the deck. So that's our removal and interaction category. We're also running 1,000 Winds, 6 mana, 5/6 flying. When it's turned face up, return all other tapped creatures to their owner's hands. And of course, you can morph it if you are desperate, but we definitely want to be manifest dreading this with Zimone. All right, and then I think we just need to touch on the mana base here, and that will wrap us up. So for our mana base, once again, we're running all of the relevant fetch lands. The worst fetch land in our deck actually is at the top here. Bant Panorama. Now, the Panoramas enter untapped and can tap for colorless, and you pay 1 to then crack it to search for a basic, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So the fetching ability itself does cost mana, which I'm not a fan of, but it's yet another fetch effect we can put in the deck, and the synergy with Zimone, if we have a Tree Shaker Chimera that we want to flip up, then we definitely want to pay 1 to do that, to get that flip up trigger off of Zimone. Breeding Pool, if we have anything that searches for force, specifically from our more expensive cards such as Polluted Delta, we can grab actually Breeding Pool off of a Polluted Delta because it's technically an island. Broker's Hideout gets that fetch land immediately. Cabaret Courtyard, same thing. Demolition Field is technically a fetch land that can also destroy a non-basic land while we're at it, which is pretty nice, but it does cost 2 mana, so a little bit more expensive. Escape Tunnel, sack it for free, fetch for free. Evolving Wilds, fetch for free. Fabled Passage, fetch for free. Flooded Strand, fetch for free untapped, which is pretty nice. We are running 14 basics because a lot of these are searching for basics and also specific typed basics, right? So Broker's Hideout will allow us to grab a forest or island, but something like a Cabaret Courtyard only allows us to grab a forest that's relevant to our deck. So we do need a decent amount of basics to fuel all of these fetch lands, so we're running 14 of them. Maester's Theater, free fetch. Misty Rainforest, free fetch. Same thing with Obscure Storefront. We'll skip past more of the fetch lands here. River Tears Overlooks. Simic Growth Chamber we already mentioned. It's our only bounce land in the deck. I was looking at potentially including Arid Archway and, oh gosh, what is the other one? I'm going to have to look it up here. Arid Archway and Guildless Commons. The problem here is the deck really, really wants fetch lands. And when you're playtesting, you sort of try to pick up on what the deck wants you to do. And anytime I had a bounce land in my hand, I just thought to myself, boy, I'd rather have a fetch land in my hand. And so that's why we see so many heavy fetch, such a heavy fetch land mana base. But we're running the one Simic Growth Chamber so that we can grab it with the, what is it called again? Elvish Reclaimer right here. It's just a great card to grab off of Elvish Reclaimer, and it ramps you because it produces 2. Talongates of Madara, not a fetch land, and it is actually decently expensive, but it is technically an extra landfall trigger if we pay the 4 mana to put it from our hand onto the battlefield, and it also allows up to 1 target creature to face out, so it is an expensive bit of protection and an extra landfall trigger, which is, you know, just a great extra soft synergy within the deck. Terramorphic Expanse, free fetch. Urborg, already touched on to allow our fetch lands to tap 4 mana. Verdant Catacombs, free fetch. Windswept Heath, Wooded Foothills are all free fetches. And Yavimaya to allow our lands to tap 4 green. That is the deck, everybody. Once again, this deck is able to assemble a lethal board state by about turn 7 on average. So Zimone, just a great value generator. It's just another take on a Simic Landfall, but I think with the extra intrigue of face down creatures. And the interesting thing as well is with face down creatures, if you want to turn them face up by paying the creature's cost, it does not even use the stack. It is a special action that you can use at any time. And so that is amazing to pull combat tricks out of your behind when your opponents are attacking you. And now you have a giant Zapandrel to block with or something like that. So yeah, closing thoughts. Oh, I did want to touch on really quick the notable exclusions from the deck. Scroll of Fate, also not in the deck. It's too expensive to just straight tap to manifest a card from our hand. Does it seem like it would be in the deck? Yes. Is it, you know, in the top 2 or 3 cuts? Yes, it's probably the 102nd or 103rd card within the deck. But it just doesn't do enough, in my personal opinion, for 3 mana because we can be able to get those Zimone triggers for much less by simply playing a fetch land. Hauntwood Shrieker, another card that really seems like it would work well in this deck. However, what I noticed is that when I had it in my hand or on the field, when I have it in my hand, it's too much mana to play to simply turn face down permanents we control face up, because you're playing 3 mana and then an extra 2 mana after that. It does get an attack trigger to Manifest Dread, but it's too weak to survive combat and only being a 3/3. So I noticed I never wanted to actually attack with Hauntwood Shrieker because you would lose the ability to turn face down permanents face up by paying the 2. So it's a card that's really at odds with itself. Great in limited, of course. But I just think in Commander, it's not durable enough to survive the combat. And really what we want to be doing is flipping permanents face up with Zimone, and this feels like a second copy of Zimone it just does a worse impression of what Zimone is looking to do. So I'd almost rather just recast Zimone from the command zone for 6 mana than run a Hauntwood Shrieker in the deck. And then I did have in the deck originally Spelunking and Amulet of Vigor. Both of these cards allow you to untap your tapped lands when they enter, and Spelunking in particular allows you to get an additional land drop. So maybe I'll consider Spelunking, actually. That's kind of a neat, instead of maybe like I don't know, maybe I'll have to look at it later. But I just think that this is gumming up my hand, A, because it's not a creature, and B, because we don't care too much about our lands entering untapped. We are really just looking for those landfall triggers. I mean, yes, is it good? This is probably the 101st card in the deck. I think I'd probably put this in over any other card at the moment, but I just think that it just didn't do quite enough for 3 mana. But I mean, is it a good card? Yes. It's just right on the edge of that cutting line, man. I mean, like, honestly, maybe I'll look at cutting something else for it. More to come on that. If you guys actually click on the deck link down below and Spelunky is in it, don't be surprised because I may have found a card to swap for it, but because it's just so good. Okay, so that is the deck, everybody. Once again, if you enjoyed this deck tech, leave a like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And then here we'll move to the end step of the video. So the reason why I haven't been able to upload in the past week or so is just because I've had a lot of life stuff going on at the moment. Our furnace and AC went out, so trying to line up the funds to replace that. I had my car in the shop, so I was without a car for 2 weeks. And then our like microwave cracked today, so we're gonna have to get a new microwave. And just a bunch of stuff has been going on that's just kept me busy outside of all of this. We're trying to get dog training lined up for our dog, and so that's taking time to start training with the dog, and you're spending time training with the dog itself. And then on top of that, I've been trying to eat healthier and exercise more. So you know, that's eat ups time, because then by the time you get done running for 2 miles, which takes, you know, me personally between 20 and 23 minutes typically, and then you shower, which is another 15 minutes, that's just more time taken up out of the day. So YouTube has just sort of, it's just been on the back burner. It's obviously a passion of mine. You'll still see me uploading videos and stuff. It's just I have not been able to really make as much content as I wanted to in the past week or so, just because I've had other crap to deal with. And it is nice to have heat and air conditioning in your house, especially in Minnesota. Luckily, I will say, luckily, the week that we are without, well, actually, we've been without heat for probably 2.5 weeks now, and we just happen to have the most perfect weather. As I record this, it's October in 2024, and the highs are around between like 65 and 70 in the next week, and they have been for the past couple weeks. So we lost our heat at the exact perfect time weather-wise, so that we're not freezing our booty off in this house. And then literally the day that I was meeting with our the vendor who was going to replace the furnace and air conditioning systems, literally the day that he was sitting in the house and we were discussing package options and so forth, the air conditioning went out. Like, I turned on the AC and nothing happened. And we've had this issue before where the capacitor will go on the AC, and it's just an indication that the AC is old. I mean, both systems are 20 years old. I don't think they've been replaced since the house was actually built. So great timing all around. I feel it's mixed feelings, you know, because I am going to spend, I'll just give you a range between $10,000 and $15,000 to replace both of these systems, of which I do get some equity back in the house, right? I mean, it does improve the value of the house, but not as much as I would like. When I was looking on the internet, about 30% of the value you get back in equity within your house. So, you know, I'm forking over all this cash, but I also feel fortunate because it happened at the exact right time weather-wise, so that we're not freezing our butt off. I mean, imagine if this happened in January, right? Minnesota gets down to like -4 Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius. Y'all Canadians and Europeans can do that, Google. But yeah, it is awful. It gets down to like -6, -4 in the depths of January in Minnesota, and it is awful. So anyway, that is the video, guys. Thank you all for listening to me rant here. Zimone Mystery Unraveler, great commander to experiment with, and I hope this video gave you some ideas to build your own version of Zimone. So once again, I will have that companion video linked down in the description below. You can see how this deck actually functions in a playtest environment, and within those videos, I do modulate the amount of removal that we would expect to be hit Zimone, so that we have a realistic expectation of how the deck can perform against real opponents. That's the video, guys. My name is Nathan. You've been watching Salty Productions. Hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.